favorite things he ever told me that his father told him. When you're playing music, if you ever make a mistake, do it twice, so that way people think you did it on purpose.
As Eddie Van Halen's son, Wolfgang didn't just inherit a last name, he inherited the weight of a rock and roll empire. From the moment he first joined the band, the world saw a story of destiny, a prince taking his rightful place on stage. But while the crowds roared for the legend, Wolfgang was guarding his father's devastating secret.
He used to leave me messages like that all the time, and I thought that one was a really great way to cap the video off.
A quiet crisis was unfolding right in front of the world, but only he could see it. What was the secret battle his father was fighting behind the scenes? And how did that struggle lead to Wolfgang's silent vow to never play his father's music again? This isn't the story the magazines told. This is the truth about the price he paid for that legendary name. The shadow of the crown. Wolfgang William Van Halen was born not just to a rock star, but to a musical revolutionary. His father, Eddie Van Halen, had rewritten the rulebook for the electric guitar, and his mother, Valerie Bertinelli, was America's sweetheart, a beloved television star. Their marriage was a Hollywood fairy tale on the surface, but a complicated reality behind closed doors, strained by the pressures of immense fame and Eddie's well-documented struggles with addiction. Wolfgang was born directly into this crucible, becoming the quiet center of their universe and the undeniable glue that held his parents together for as long as they were. His birthright wasn't just fame, it was immense, suffocating expectation. From the moment he could hold an instrument, the public watched and waited, assuming he was being groomed to be the heir to the Van Halen throne, a carbon copy of the genius who was his dad. But inside their famous 5,150 studio, a different, more organic story was unfolding. It didn't start with a guitar. It started with a drum kit Eddie bought him for his 10th birthday. There were no grueling lessons, no demands for perfection that Eddie often placed on himself and his bandmates. Having endured a strict classical piano upbringing himself, Eddie was determined to give his son the opposite experience. He simply wanted Wolfgang to find the same joy in music that had saved him. Their bond was forged in these quiet moments. Wolfgang would listen to his dad's recorded riffs and try to keep up on the drums, forging a private language of rhythm and sound that only they understood. He later taught himself bass, then guitar, not out of duty, but out of a deep personal curiosity. He would spend countless hours alone in the studio, not just learning Van Halen songs, but deconstructing the music of bands like Blink-182, System of a Down, and Tool. He was building his own musical identity, brick by brick, in the very workshop his father had made legendary. Reportedly, Eddie once walked in on him, playing every single instrument on a layered recording he had made, and was left speechless. A combination of awe and profound fatherly pride. He saw not an heir, but an artist. That pure bond, however, was about to be tested in the most public and brutal way imaginable. In 2006, the rock world was seismically shaken by an announcement. Van Halen had a new bassist, and it was Eddie's 15-year-old son, Wolfgang. He was replacing Michael Anthony, a founding member whose signature high harmony backing vocals were as integral to the Van Halen sound as Eddie's guitar work. The backlash from the fan base was immediate, vicious, and widespread. This wasn't just seen as nepotism, it was perceived as a betrayal. Fans felt a core piece of the band's soul had been ripped out and replaced with the boss's kid. Overnight, Wolfgang went from being a teenager jamming in his dad's studio to a global figure of controversy. He was thrown into the deepest end of the rock and roll ocean, stepping onto the world's biggest stages under a crushing cloud of doubt. He wasn't just expected to play the bass lines flawlessly, he was also expected to replicate Anthony's iconic vocals, a task seasoned professionals would find daunting. He was facing a trial by fire, forced to prove his musical worth every single night in front of thousands of skeptical, often hostile fans. He had to be perfect, not just for himself, but to justify his father's deeply controversial decision. The weight on his teenage shoulders was immense, but what no one in the crowd screaming his name, or cursing it, could possibly know was that his real job wasn't listed on the tour itinerary. As the years went on, Eddie's health was quietly beginning to falter. The lingering, destructive effects of his past battles with addiction and his first bout with tongue cancer in the early 2000s were taking a serious toll. Wolfgang's presence on tour became more than just a family affair. He was a stabilizing force, a source of comfort and normalcy for an increasingly fragile icon who trusted his son more than anyone. His real job wasn't just to hold down the low end. It was a quiet, unspoken arrangement between a father and son. He was there to watch over his dad, and soon that silent duty would evolve into an all-consuming secret that would define the rest of his father's life and nearly break his own spirit. The silence behind the stage. The period between 2012 and 2015 should have been the greatest time of Wolfgang's life. Van Halen had released a different kind of truth, their first album in over a decade, and it was a critical and commercial success. They embarked on a massively successful world tour, playing to sold-out arenas of adoring fans. The public narrative was one of glorious redemption and impossible resurrection. Eddie Van Halen, sober and seemingly healthy, was playing with a fire and precision that critics thought was long gone. On stage beside him was Wolfgang, no longer the controversial kid, but a formidable musician in his own right, locking in with his uncle Alex to form a thunderous rhythm section. Night after night, they presented a perfect, powerful picture of a rock and roll family dynasty, triumphant and unbreakable. It was a flawless public image, and it was a complete and utter lie. Behind the deafening curtain of roaring applause and blinding flashing lights, a grim and secret reality was unfolding. The core truth, which Wolfgang would keep hermetically sealed for years, was that Eddie's cancer had returned, and it was far more aggressive than anyone outside their innermost circle knew. Having already endured a media circus during his first cancer battle, Eddie was terrified of the pity and the invasive speculation a public diagnosis would bring. He believed his identity as the invincible guitar god would be shattered, replaced by the image of a frail patient. So he made a decision. No one could know, and the keeper of that silence, the sole guardian of that terrifying secret, was his son. Wolfgang, barely in his early 20s, was now living a shocking, exhausting double life. He was no longer just the bassist for Van Halen. He had become his father's primary confidant, caregiver, and protector. His world became a dizzying, disorienting rotation of unimaginable extremes. One moment, he was feeling the floor shake from the roar of 20,000 fans as he performed Panama. The next, he was in the stark, silent sterility of a hotel room, poring over oncology reports, coordinating with doctors across continents, researching experimental treatments, and ensuring his father took his complex regimen of medications on a strict schedule. He described it as a constant, jarring transition from the chaotic, colorful world of a rock show to the cold, grayscale reality of a hospital waiting room. The pressure was immense and profoundly isolating. Surrounded by a massive touring crew, bandmates, and adoring fans, Wolfgang was utterly alone with his burden. He couldn't confide in anyone for fear the secret would leak, which would devastate his father. He had to put on a brave face for the media and for the fans, all while watching the man he idolized fight a brutal private war. He managed every appointment, every discreet flight to Germany for specialized radiation treatments, and every terrifying update from oncologists. This was the hidden crisis behind the comeback tour. While the world saw a rock god's triumphant return, Wolfgang saw a father in pain, a man growing weaker, relying solely on his son to navigate the darkest chapter of his life. The burden was more than just logistical. It was a soul-crushing emotional weight. On stage, he would subtly watch his father for any sign of weakness or fatigue, his heart pounding with a fear no one else could understand, praying he could make it through the 2-hour set. This was his real role, the one no one ever saw. In Eddie's final years, as his health declined further, music became secondary. The studio sessions and rehearsals were replaced by quiet moments, watching old science fiction movies and just being together. The true performance was the one of normalcy they maintained for the outside world. As Wolfgang recently confessed, the biggest pressure he ever felt wasn't living up to his father's musical genius. It was the crushing emotional weight of knowing he was the only thing standing between his father and a secret that would have shattered the triumphant narrative Van Halen had so carefully built. It was a promise between a father and son, a final, silent pact that would change the course of Wolfgang's life forever. Last tribute to Eddie Van Halen. When Eddie Van Halen passed away on October 6, 2020, the world lost a guitar hero. But Wolfgang lost his entire world, his father, his best friend, his bandmate, and the man whose secret he had protected for more than a decade. In the immediate aftermath, the public and the music industry began to speculate wildly. Would there be a massive, star-studded tribute concert? Would Van Halen continue with a new guitarist, perhaps Zakk Wylde or Joe Satriani? All eyes turned to Wolfgang, the perceived heir apparent. The expectation was crystal clear. He would be the one to carry the Van Halen torch into the future. Instead, he made a decision that many saw as shocking, disrespectful, and even unforgivable. He flatly refused to play Van Halen's music. In interview after interview, with a resolve that seemed to harden with each question, he was adamant. "I only ever want to play those songs with my dad. That's the only way I'll do it." The backlash was swift and, in some corners of the internet, cruel. He was accused of being selfish, of disrespecting the legacy, of abandoning the very music that gave him his name and career. But what these critics couldn't possibly understand was that his refusal was not an act of disrespect. It was a direct and painful trauma response. For Wolfgang, those songs weren't just rock anthems. They were the soundtrack to the most difficult and painful years of his life. They were tangled up in the secret he had carried. Performing them on stage would be like pretending the last 10 years hadn't happened, pretending his primary role in the band wasn't as his father's silent protector. His final tour with his dad wasn't a rock and roll fantasy. It was a grueling, emotional marathon of fear and responsibility. Playing that music without him felt like a betrayal of the private reality they had shared. His escape and his survival came in the form of his own band, Mammoth WVH. The name itself was a tender nod to the past. It was the name of his father and uncle's first band, but the music was entirely his own, a powerful blend of hard rock and alternative melody that he wrote and performed entirely himself on his debut album. This was his act of liberation. His first single, Distance, was his true and only tribute, a heartbreakingly personal letter to his father, released just a month after his death. The song's viral music video, a montage of intimate family home videos, finally gave the world a glimpse of the man Wolfgang had been protecting. Not a rock god, but a goofy, loving dad. It was his way of saying goodbye, on his own terms. Now, at 34, Wolfgang is finally carefully reframing his own story. In candid interviews with outlets like Howard Stern, he has begun to peel back the layers of the secret he held for so long. He is explaining that his entire career has been fundamentally misunderstood. He wasn't a kid coasting on his father's fame. He was a son enlisted to guard a legend's fragile final years. Every decision he's made since his father's death, from refusing to play the old songs to pouring his grief and anger into his own albums, has been a necessary step in a long, arduous process of healing. His music isn't a rejection of his father. It's the very first thing he has ever been able to do entirely for himself, free from the crushing, silent weight of the secret he so dutifully and lovingly kept. Wolfgang Van Halen was born into the shadow of a giant, but the greatest burden he carried wasn't the weight of a guitar, but the weight of a secret. For over a decade, he stood beside his father not just as a bandmate, but as a silent guardian, a role the world never saw. His refusal to simply become the next Van Halen wasn't an act of rebellion. It was the final, painful act of a devoted son choosing to let go. His journey has never been about escaping his father's legacy, but about processing the immense responsibility of protecting the man behind it. Now, as he forges his own path, he forces us to ask a difficult question. Was Wolfgang's greatest inheritance the Van Halen name, or the quiet strength he discovered while carrying his father through the darkness? What do you think of Wolfgang's decision to create his own musical identity? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more.